advance, it's not literary, right? This is actually taken from what will probably become the final chapter of the book that I'm currently working on, Space in Another Time, a post-colonial essay on ruins, monuments, and the management of modern life. Vangelis was, just to speak a little bit to what Vangelis said about my ardor for Miravilis, this talk is about Molivos as a space and what Molivos as a space allows one to see, of course, right, in Lesvos, Molivos in Lesvos. And I'm giving this one here right now, partly also because Gary said, we'll talk about the place where, right, and that this is a good way of talking about, of introducing people who may know nothing about the space to it. But I did encounter Miravidis in actually the village bookshop, as I said this morning, right? And it was kind of interesting. It had more to do with the fact that I am a trained, not just post-colonial scholar, but also an early modernist, as some of you know. And of course, when I started traveling freely at a certain moment in my life in the 30s, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to Italy. What book should I take? And of course, I should take Henry James. And I'm going to Greece. What should I be reading, right? And I got there, and my reaction was, this is just Orientalist drivel. I mean, this is great stuff. I mean, they're great writers and all that. But I reacted to it as a South Asian reacting to Orientalism. And I said, I can't read this. I don't want to read about, sort of hags in black or crones, as Pico Iyer just did it in the New York Times, in black dresses and, carrying the weight of timelessness as we walk in Odysseus's footsteps, or whoever. Sorry, I don't want to swear into the internet, but as we walk in these footsteps, right, while the feet that are like trampling the space in the moment, and I feel like I'm quoting Seferi's Mycena here, are completely invisible. So what I had was a reaction, and that reaction had everything to do with being a post-colonialist, right? And then I came here, and anyway, and then so I bought Miravilis, and it was a kind of like, I should actually read a local writer. And I don't mean local as in from Lesvos. I should just read a Greek writer. I know nothing about modern Greece. And yes, I've heard of Seferis and all that, but I don't. And I read novels for fun, so why not? And then, as time unfolded, and this will come up in the talk, I mean, I got really interested and I wanted to write about it. The ardor that you referred to, and I can't let go of that word, as you can see, is actually also for an Indian writer that I'm not going to talk about now, and who's also mentioned in that piece on ekphrasis, Rathalan Heather, who has become the other epistemological gateway, if you will, right, in this book project. And the book project is about Greece at the center, but it's about understandings of Greece kind of around the 19th century, 18th century, and then Lausanne, and Indian partition. And some of the stuff about the picturesque that I won't go in, but it's a talk that I just gave in Amsterdam, actually has to do with understandings of ruination that are explicitly tied to colonial governance in in India. So James Ferguson will say that the picturesque and the ruin, right, is a form of palatable knowledge, right? These lithographs that he makes of ruins and monuments is a form of palatable knowledge that actually allows us to produce knowledge about India that will allow us to govern, right? And Curzon will subsequently read that as a custodial narrative, right? That it's our custody of this place. So we have to save these monuments. But Ferguson also says something else that's very interesting that I'm not, again, this is the larger project, right? That I'm not talking about in this. And that is that, we know so much about Greece. And he's talking about India, right? But Greece keeps coming up as a counterpoint. We know so much about Greece. And if something happened to a ruin or a monument in Greece, we'd be instinctively empathetic, is the way he puts it, right? As a Phil-Hellenic product himself in the 1830s or so, thereabouts. But why don't we feel the same way about Greece? sorry, about India, and then sorry, this is a migraine. But he then also goes on to say that if something happened to Greece tomorrow, we wouldn't care. Greece and Asia Minor, but India is ours, right? So there's this really interesting contrapuntal relationship between Greece and India in the structure of ruination. It then turns out, of course, that Curzon is the foreign minister, foreign secretary, whatever it is, of England at the time of Lausanne, who's presiding over the Lausanne Treaty. It's also the case that Schliemann dedicates his book on, I think, Mycenae, or is it Terence, one of the two, to Ferguson, right? So there's a kind of traffic between archaeological thinking about India and Greece that Bernard Cohen has talked about, that others have mentioned, but that has never been given its full due, right? And John Marshall, who is responsible for Mohenjo-daro and Harappa in India, actually, and I showed this in the talk I just gave at CUNY, that newspaper, I don't know if I showed it in Amsterdam, that newspaper, right, from the London, the tabloid, that says in the early 1920s, an Indian Tyrans in Mycenae discovered, right? So that's actually partly what the project is also trying to explore, but that would not have meant, I would not have understood what these writers were trying, what Heather was trying to do, what was at stake in all of this, unless I had had the experience of being here, right? So it's been a kind of, there are two epistemological prompts for the book. One is Molivos itself, right? And being here for the first time and being in Greece. And the second is Bertha and Heather's work and the way she talks about Greekness and about the Indian Khilafat movement, how she talks about the paradoxes of Indian Muslim identification with the Ottoman Empire as an anti-colonial project, about the fact, and she actually mentions Byron's ironic, she has an Indian character in the 19th century mention Byron's ironic affiliation with Greece, but a complete neglect of Indian British colonialism. So it's a part of it is like, sort of trying to also uncover these earlier discourses that were completely interconnected, but now are now actually just led through national lens, right? That our epistemologies are in fact entirely nationalist now. And I mean nationalist in the sense of that's what limits, or that's what outlines thinking, how we do it. So in any case, so that's a kind of long and kind of digressive preamble to something that may not connect to that at all. But here we are. In 2007, I was given the opportunity to teach in Simon Fraser University's Hellenic Studies Field School in Kefalonia and Lesbos. And this was actually written for a different audience in Lesbos, in New Brunswick, but so some of it might sound weird because you've just seen all of this, so why am I talking about it again? But here we are. It's like we figure that if we repeat it over and over again for the next 4 days, it'll just settle. Anyway, the following year, also the year of the global financial collapse, the school was moved to Lesbos for its entire 6-week duration. Thank you, Dimitri. Dimitri was like, there's no way. What do you mean? We're going to be outside Lesbos. Anyway, the school took place here in Molivos until 2009, and it has recently been revived. Molivos is an instructive space. The economy is driven by tourism. Historically, the village has chosen an aesthetic profile based on experimental arts and committed to the preservation of the historical pristineness of the past, emblematized by the village's central monument, the Byzantine and thus not properly classical castle at its top. The economy has been affected by the global economic crisis of 2008, the Greek debt crisis that followed, and then the refugee situation in 2015. Please also notice that I never ignore Fivos, and he has told me that I can never say the phrase refugee crisis, so I don't. So the refugee situation in 2015, also the year when the debt crisis reached its culmination in the clash between the Syriza government and Angela Merkel and Wolfgang Schäuble in Germany. It should also be said that in 2014, there was actually a significant uptick in tourism, right? So the refugee crisis situation, I just completely undid myself, did in fact affect tourism, right? And through mediatization. And I'll talk about it a bit more. A frontline village during the arrival of the refugees in 2015, prior to the arrival of the international NGOs and relief organizations, and before the EU-Turkey deal, Molyvos is a place where the effects of neoconservative wars and neoliberalism can be seen to converge, and where the aesthetics of preservation and ruination have led to a crisis in the village's identity as two forms of mobility, tourist and refugee, collide. As such, if one focuses on movement and space, one can see Molivos as a microcosm of the collisions and contradictions of our current global moment, illustrating the way movement constitutes space, but also how space constitutes populations. In 2007, I had no particular interest in Greece. I saw the offer to teach simply as an opportunity to work in a different country in beautiful surroundings. Indeed, given my humanistic training, Greece was merely a kind of cipher for Europe's assertions about its originary superiority, a Winckelmannian fantasy of ruins, sculptural perfection, aesthetic balance, and Europe's claims to embodying perfect freedom, and as such had little interest for me. In fact, I had a kind of allergic reaction to it. But as a post-colonialist, I decided to teach a course on post-colonial and postmodern reworkings and deconstructions of Greek antiquity for the field school, Derek Walcott's Omeros, and Christo Wolf's Cassandra, among others, right? And in the longer version of this, which when it becomes a chapter, I will actually do a reading of Walcott and what Walcott has to say about global capitalism in Omeros. Of course, as Greeks know, the Philhellenic fantasy has come at a spectacularly high cost for Greece. I mean, even as Greeks are conflicted about it, obviously, especially since the debt crisis that followed the global economic collapse. Roughly 4 miles from Turkey, as the documentary 4.1 Miles by Madziarakis, in which it features, reminds us, Molivos presents a complex spatial challenge to the Philhellenic vision of Greece. The contradictions of the aesthetics of ruination, which power Philhellenism, converge in the village. A castle, Byzantine, Genoese, Ottoman, and again, it's like repetition, with the Shahada. You haven't seen this yet. It says Bismillah on top, right? Inscribed above the entrance, sits atop the village, atop the hill on which the village is built. At the very top of the castle flutters the Greek flag, an emblem of the success of Neo-Hellenism and the formation of the Greek state, although not until 1912 did Lesvos get absorbed into Greece. After the Asia Minor disaster, as it's called sometimes, and the fall of Smyrna, which signaled the failure of the Greek irredentist dream of reconstituting a Greek imperium of the Michale Idea, figures like Ilias Venezis, the artist Fotis Kantoglu, and others from the Greek modernist 30s generation gathered on the island, and Venezis' house is a few miles outside Molivos in the village of Eftalou, across a narrow road bordering the beach where boatloads of refugees arrived in 2015. Of course, this history brings together the formalization of displacement in the regime of treaties and agreements regarding refugees and minorities in the post-World War I era, the dissolution of empires such as the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman, the effects of the Lausanne Treaty on the social constitution and national identities of both Greece and Turkey, and a crucial moment in the history of Greek and global modernism. During the refugee influx of 2015, Greek activists and officials invoked the refugee history of Lesvos and other islands, sometimes invoking the idea of philoxenia or hospitality. Left and anarchist activists are quick to point out that they prefer the word solidarity. I'm listening very carefully, as you might see, to viewers. However, the international discourse regarding the present refugee situation on islands such as Lesvos elides these connections, which nonetheless keep rising to the surface as we hear stories of Greek-speaking refugees arriving from former parts of the Ottoman Empire. Since 2008, and this is kind of awe and surprise and astonishment and all kinds of things, and depending on your ideology, right, about it. And then the media kind of, does a little dance for a couple of days and then forgets it all again. But since 2008, the inhabitants, many of them immigrants from other parts of Greece, some from Northern Europe, from northern countries of the EU, sometimes jokingly called settlers, have seen a precipitous decline in income caused by 2 financial crises, and then the way in which the media marketed the refugee influx, and of course, by the refugee influx itself, all of which have affected tourism. Rather temporarily, the arrival of refugees also provided a boost in winter income. in 2015 and 16. And suddenly, more parts of Molivos are open in the winter than otherwise, because of the presence of the international organizations and NGOs, which at the same time led to a fair amount of resentment from the more tolerant and welcoming members of the village community at what was perceived, rightly in my view, as a rather imperial condescension. I have to say that I read all of this very much as a Pakistani, right? So you talk about crisis, and I think that I come from a country in which crisis has been the descriptor for just about as long as I can remember, right? And what it forecloses. It's very important, right? I mean, it's permanent crisis. And so we publish books periodically like Beyond Crisis, or we want to Beyond Crisis. And so it's aspirational and hopeful and entirely non-utopian, but I mean, it's kind of aspiration as a structure of despair. How's that? But in any case, but at the same time, it's also important because what was so interesting about watching those NGOs and, Doctors Without Borders and so on, in their kind of jeeps, right? Kind of, and as they went up and down the harbor road and everyone went into the village, was astonishing. Was astonishing, but also entirely familiar to a Pakistani, right? Was that they had absolutely no interest in and quite a contempt for the local and the natives. Right, let's call it what it was. And it was interesting because, of course, and I started reflecting on this because the whole rescue narrative upon which the international NGO is predicated, structurally speaking, right, is one of the failed state, right? So they come in to clean up messes that confused post-colonial natives can't. That's actually the structure, right? And that was being actually exhibited here because they didn't fully know what to do with the space. Now, you can figure out if that's the third worldization of Greece or Greece was already the third world, right? That depends on where you want to be. And I'm not going to stir that hornet's nest when most of you, Dimitri's laughing his head off because he knows exactly where I stand on this. But still, so I think it's very important to think of it in those terms. Anyway, Molyvos and some of its surrounding areas then are a space constituted by several kinds of movement, where, as I said earlier, a number of contemporary contradictions and crises converge. This is equally true of other spaces in and out of Greece, but I'm concerned here with the village, right? It's the microcosm that interests me. One, the movement of financial capital. The village was affected first by the financial collapse and then the debt crisis, which began to affect the livelihood of inhabitants as tourism began to decline, especially middle-range tourism of the kind to which it catered, as people's disposable incomes dipped. At the same time, the tension we saw in the debt crisis was between the inescapability of the nation and the illusion of the transcendence of the nation promised by the European Union. Capital is about the only thing that transcends the nation and circulates beyond. Debt, however, is held by the nation and its inhabitants, citizens otherwise pay for it, right? And this is, I think, a kind of really crucial point because we keep saying that there are no borders, right? So where's the border? When is the border and where is the border, right? And it's a chronotopic question, space and time both. Two, movement of commodities and the current constitution of planetary conflict by the culture of extraction, which has led to numerous wars in the Middle East and which has also resulted in great immiseration in the global South. Indeed, the absence of colonial history in discussions of the subject of refugee movement is significant for the analytical blindness it fosters. Perhaps most egregious in this regard is the relative absence of African refugees from most discussions of the refugee influx of 2015 and subsequent to it, enabling in turn the erasure of Europe's colonial history and Europe's role in Africa and in the wars in the Middle East and West Asia. 3, the movement of environmental pollutants. The scenes of beaches strewn with discarded life vests are too numerous to mention. I was taken to what Phoebus, and this is actually Phoebus Simonides, as I said, in New Brunswick, who took me there, called a graveyard of life vests, right? We went together. Now collected into these dumps, at the height of the arrivals in 2015, there were mounds of life vests and abandoned plastic everywhere, and I have some photographs from that moment. One might thus theorize environmental degradation and climate change through movement. The movement or transfer of the cost of the North's planetary footprint to the global South, the movement of everyone's North and South plastic and waste through the oceans, And the movement of people from the south to the north we are already seeing and are likely to see in greater numbers as desertification and climate change accelerate the uninhabitability of large swathes of the planet. And we know, and Kristen Parenti and I have talked about this at some length, that there are security plans in place. And I mean, Europe is already doing it, outsourcing its detention centers even into Africa and so on. But the US also has plans for it, right? Because what are we going to do with these people? So a lot of what we're seeing, in my view, around the refugee situation is in fact preemptive also. That whatever is happening now, right, is a precursor and a harbinger of something that's truly unmanageable. Right. So if we can we can call it unmanageable now. I mean, and I'm having this thought as I speak, right? Maybe we can preempt future movement by making it both rhetorically and discursively on the one hand, and actually and physically impossible on the other, right? 4, tourist movement, in this case mobilized by selling the most commodified aspects of Greekness: ruins, sun, sea, right? And that's it everywhere. Just check out our brochure. We've got it all. Right? You haven't seen it yet, but we've got a castle, we've got a little village, we've got like the water, it's all there. So 5, migrant refugee movement / refugee movement, very much determined by Lesvos and Molyvos being a border / liminal space, constituted and undone by proximity and past belonging to Asia Minor, now shaped by Greece's subsumption into something called Europe. Refugees often don't know where they have arrived. And I actually had this experience greeting people. Where are we? I'm in Italy. Refugees often don't know where they have arrived because, of course, the 4.1 miles are not the distance between Greece and Turkey or the reconstituting Neo-Hellenic nation state of 1912 and the dissolving Ottoman Empire, but between the East and West, or Asia and, quote, Europe. The refugees, it must be said, are not fleeing to Greece, but to Europe. Whether they want to stay in Greece or not, they're actually fleeing to Europe, right? Best emblematized to many by the Europe of the North. By making it possible to reveal these contradictions in histories, a space like Molivos thus restores another dimension to the question of displacement, the related problematic of citizenship, statelessness, and the nation state, and the assumed right of the nation state to constitute and determine its population through a controlled taxonomy, or put differently, a controlling of taxonomy. Here, Lesbos' extraction from the Ottoman Empire in 1912 and the relation of that movement to the formalized population transfers of the Lausanne Treaty is crucial, as that history opens into precisely those paradoxes of the nation state, the political complexities of the minorities treaties of the early 20th century, and the crisis of citizenship, and indeed of the very status of humans, Hannah Arendt laid out in the chapter Decline of the Nation State and the End of the Rights of Man in the Origins of Totalitarianism, and that she discussed in moving, personal, and tragically ironic terms in her personal essay, We Refugees. In a chapter in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she wrote, and I'm sorry for those of you who've heard me talk before, I keep quoting it, the framers of the minority treaties did not foresee the possibility of wholesale population transfers, or the problem of people who had become, in quotes, undeportable because there was no country on earth in which they enjoyed the right to residence. The minorities could still be regarded as an exceptional phenomenon, peculiar to certain territories that deviated from the norm. This argument was always tempting because it left the system itself untouched. It has, in a way, survived the Second World War. And this is, of course, the point that Asli Egzes, who is making in a magnificent new book, Humanism in Ruins, it has, in a way, survived the Second World War, whose peacemakers, convinced of the impracticality of minorities treaties, began to, quote, repatriate nationalities as much as possible in an effort to unscramble the, quote, belt of mixed populations, end of quote. And this attempted large-scale repatriation was that's the end of the quote within Arendt. Arendt is not over yet. And this attempted large-scale repatriation was not the direct result of the catastrophic experiences following in the wake of the minorities treaties. Rather, it was hoped that such a step would finally solve a problem which in the preceding decades had assumed ever larger proportions and for which an internationally recognized and accepted procedure simply did not exist, the problem of the stateless people, end of quote. The current situation reminds us that the problem of displacement, citizenship, statelessness, and of minority Arendt discussed, the problems are still very much with us. And I'd like to conclude with a far too brief engagement with the question of minority and the population transfers, the liminal but also itself moving status of Molivos as a village on the island of Lesvos makes visible. As Lesbos moved to Greece from the Ottoman Empire, and after Greece became part of the EU, in that move became unmistakably Europe, it, as Europe, acquired the power to confer or withhold from residents the status of legal persons, right? I speak here both of Lesbos' legal status as territory and the status of in brackets, legality, its own national and then European status forces upon those who arrive there. In the previous sentence, I used the word resident with deliberate ambiguity. For those in camps, also known as hotspots, such as Moria, do indeed reside there. What this movement asks us to consider is both what is a resident, but also what is Europe as an entity. For space does not neatly align with territory here at all. The formalization of displacement and the production of ethnicized and religionized national identities in the Lausanne Convention took place as a result of the wars that had led to the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the transfer of Lesbos to Greece. In this, there's a simultaneous, and I'm talking about a series, the Balkan, the World War I, and so on, and then, whatever happened in Smyrna and Izmir. In this, there's a simultaneous formalization of a taxonomy in which we are to imagine Christian as Greek, which is what Wengelis was also talking about, and Muslim as Turk, and send them to a territory where they always already belong. The nation state is the organizing political spatial unit on which the Lausanne Convention is predicated. The fact that Armenians cannot be accommodated in this taxonomy is, of course, precisely to encounter the question of statelessness with which Arendt was concerned. One might add that the camp is the internal-external correlative of that problem of statelessness, space, citizenship, and national identity, where residence and life are nonetheless happening pace agamben, I want to say, right? It's not, there is life, it's not just, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, this taxonomy pulls together nationalist European colonial modes of divisions of population with the political organization of population of the Ottoman millet structure, and of course some would say that political organization itself has to do with the Tanzimat reforms, which themselves have to do with the European structures. So the question is, where is the border? Both where and when is the border, again. The structure of Greek as Christian and Muslim as Turk, formalized by Lausanne, acquires an additional layer once Greece becomes part of Europe through the Union. One of the signal, and in my view, insidious achievements of that population exchange and of the proceedings at Lausanne is that it puts in place the formalization of the expulsion of the Muslim as national group, that is Turk from Europe. Now, I'm not saying that means that all Muslims are expelled. I'm saying that it makes it discursively thinkable, right? Because once you've ethnicized or religionized a national and ethnic identity, right, you're able to do things with it, and it has everything to do with the disposability of populations in the colonial and modern era. When Greece becomes Europe in the sense of the legal spatial reorganization offered by joining the EU, that national sense of Muslim as Turk and Christian as Greek offers the possibility of making Muslim as a now denationalized and generalized category external to and expellable from Europe. That is, as Greece becomes Europe, Muslim can become non-Europe. Right? Now, this is already there in the way that, we talk about representations of the Ottomans in the early modern period, right? But if we actually think about the representations of the Ottomans in the early modern period in the way that we think about the representations of Catholics in the early modern period, for instance, think about Spencer and Duessa in The Fairy Queen, right? Where Duessa is the Catholic Church and the whore of Babylon, right? For instance, or whatever, right? You've got a completely different structure. Then you've got to actually think about, right, the Ottomans not as outsiders, right, but as potential insiders, already insiders, depending. They got very far, right? And in fact, they were there. So what actually, again, the question becomes, what is the temporal moment at which a population or a group becomes an outsider, right? It's actually not just a spatial question. It's always, and I think when it comes to Europe, always a temporal issue, right? Because, we're living in post-Hegel. Right. So, in any case, that is as Greece becomes Europe, Muslim can become non-Europe. That is, as Greece becomes more than the sum of its national identity, so does the Muslim as Turk expelled from it. Right. This is the less visible operation available in the long aftermath of the Lausanne Convention. But I would suggest that it is there in the very moment in which the dissolution of the great empires leads to the problem of unscrambling, the mixed belts, to use Arendt's terms. And of course, unscrambling always makes me think about deconstructing scrambled eggs. Like, how do you do it, right? And I'm not being flippant. I'm actually thinking about what is, right, this kind of separation actually meant to, how is it affected, not just what is it meant to do, right? And some of those contradictions we were talking about this morning were precisely about that. Although this is outside the scope of this paper, it would of course be important to think of Orthodox Islam in the Balkans in this context as well. And of course we have Vangelis here to teach us on this. Anyway, moreover, he can only cough in response. Moreover, this is not merely a question of making Muslims external to Europe, but the exchange of populations makes the Greek Christian expellable from Asia Minor and the East more generally, and thus European. Nasser merely repeats this move with Greeks in Egypt, right? So you've got to think about it. It can't just be like, East victim, West. I mean, it's a very complex dynamic. Exchange gives a patina of equality and balance to the profound violence, as an exchange of populations, to the profound violence of population exchange, even as it calls upon the ethnicized and racialized movements of population of colonial epistemology and practice. It is no accident, as I have argued elsewhere, that Curzon, who presided over Lausanne, was formerly Viceroy of India when Bengal was partitioned, or that B.R. Ambedkar cited it as a good precedent for the partition of India, all the Faisal and I have been talking about, how other people resisted the question of population transfer. But I want to be clear, I actually think that partition and population transfer are actually allied operations, right? So even if you don't transfer a population, one way of transferring a population is just to divide, right? So it's because the place moves, right? It becomes something else. And as you see Pakistan's attempts, as Faisal has written so brilliantly in Muslim Zion, right, to actually expel that past, right? As just kind of to cut itself off from the past, we see again the temporal element. What we see in the de- reconstitution of the space of Lesbos is the way in which space constitutes peoples in the modern era, and of how the movement of populations in turn de- reconstitutes space. The last few years in Lesvos have seen it multiply reconstituted by its status as the border space for Europe, affected by the economic confrontation between Greece and Europe, initially relatively welcoming host to arrivals that exceeded its population several times over, relatively welcoming, viewers don't glare at me, gateway to Europe, but invisible as Greece. A giant island prison for refugees after the so-called EU-Turkey deal, where the waters are patrolled by Frontex, the EU Border Patrol Agency, keeping both refugee boats and the Greek Coast Guard under check. Although I've just been told that there are also some Greeks involved in the operation of pushing people back, while Erdogan plays chicken with Europe. As a result of what happened in 2015, Europe began to deconstitute itself in its closing of internal borders. And I remember calling up RA and saying it's a matter of time before Schengen starts being discussed, and it was. But its cracks were becoming visible in the confrontation of Greece's debt as well. In this way, the space represents the crisis of what, as far back as 1995, Agamben called, quote, an impossible Europe of nations, end of quote, whose catastrophic results can already be perceived in the short term. Actually, no, that's the end of the quote. There are many quotes there. So the challenges to the nation state and the inequities created by the nation state come together in Lesbos, showing the way in which a neoliberal union in bed with neoconservatism cannot resolve the paradoxes of the nation state. Thank you.